While we're working on that, I would like to start by thanking Oldways and the conference organizers for inviting me. This gives me a chance to meet some people here who have been heroes of mine for a very long time, and that's an awfully nice thing to have happening with the conference. I want to start by talking about the overall picture of health promotion and disease prevention. Are we promoting health or not? Are we making progress? Are you all seeing the slides okay? I think undoubtedly our biggest success has been in smoking cessation. We've had a 60% reduction in the last 50 years, and there's nothing that's been nearly as successful as that. So we should feel good about it, but we still have a way to go because 17% of American adults are still smokers, and we spend an enormous amount of our healthcare budget on smoking-related diseases. We're doing better with heart disease mortality. It's down 20% reduction in the past 30 years. That's wonderful. Part of that may be the result of a lower serum cholesterol level for most people. That's gone down basically 3% in the past over the same period. And some of that is due to nutrition. But a lot of the cholesterol change and a lot of the reduction in coronary mortality has been the result of early diagnosis, prophylactic drugs, and improved treatment, not the result of primary prevention. Hypertension prevalence is going up. Obesity going up. These are not good signs for the efficacy of health promotion and disease prevention as currently practiced. Type 2 diabetes prevalence is up. Another black mark. Now, these are two slides which I think most everybody here has seen over the past few weeks. Over the long term, there has been a reduction in mortality rates in the United States and in other Western countries anyway. But just recently, in the past several years, that decline has leveled out, and that's not happy. Or also, most everyone here has seen that mortality for non-Hispanic whites in the United States is actually rising, which would be an argument against the efficacy of health promotion. I think it's also an argument against socioeconomic inequality, but we'll get to that another time, perhaps. So let's move on to what nutrition science has contributed. I'm sort of an outsider as a diagnostic radiologist, so I can look at this with from an outsider's point of view. Have the findings from nutrition science been consistent? Have the recommendations been consistent? I don't want you to try to read these little ones. Check that they come from the public media, partly from the public press, such as Consumer Reports, New York Times. They come from academic journals, respected academic journals like Science and the New England Journal, and they have been appearing regularly, consistently over the past 20 years. Now let's look at one, just to read it out. Advice to the public about what to eat and basically how to live seems to do an about-face every time a new study is published in a medical journal. And here's another one. Salt, top experts give wildly conflicting advice. So, has the public been enlightened or has it been confused? I could have shown any number of cartoons that basically make this point. Consumers today are deluged with constantly shifting health messages instead of educating the healthcare consumers. These shifting scientific studies often serve to confuse. So it might be fair to argue that health promotion has made suboptimal progress. It suffers from intellectual disarray, and it's led to public confusion. Thomas Kuhn would say that nutrition science is a pre-paradigmatic emerging discipline. If there's anyone here in the audience who is unfamiliar with Thomas Kuhn, here's a piece from the New England Times comparing Kuhn with Copernicus and Einstein, which you might say is fairly select company. Kuhn said that mature sciences operate under the aegis of a governing paradigm. I would say there is no such paradigm for health promotion. I'm not the only one saying that. Here's an article from the American Journal of Epidemiology, which basically says the same thing. We lack a unifying body of principles. Kuhn may have been channeling Einstein. Einstein said, theorists must derive basic postulates from nature. Absent such principles, the separate results of empirical research study defy deductive reasoning. Fortunately, for health promotion and nutrition science, we have a basic principle that we can look back to. And this goes to Dobzhansky's famous quotation that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So, for health promotion, there could be a basic axiom. An organism's biology functions best when it operates under conditions similar to those for which its genetic bases were originally selected through evolution. There are some postulates that derive from this axiom, and they are amenable to hypothesis testing, which is absolutely essential for any scientific discipline. We are genetic Stone Agers. The picture there was carved 25,000 years ago from ivory, from tusks of a mammoth. Deviation from the Stone Age lifestyle increases chronic disease risk, and reversion toward the Stone Age lifestyle reduces chronic disease risk. Now, this paradigm has been criticized. One of them is that we are actually genetically different from our ancestors, and that is quite true. There are genetic differences, but the ones that you can see, the traits that have been changed, such as blue eyes and hemoglobin changes and so forth, are the result of single gene modifications. More basic, fundamental processes, such as our metabolism and our nutritional needs, are affected not by a single gene, but by hundreds of genes, and those traits tend to be conserved over time. Most of the genes involved in basic cellular processes are ancient and fundamental. Their expression seems to have remained consistent across the primate lineage for 70 million years. I like this example. Our ancestors and those of cats diverged about 70 million years ago, but we remain equally susceptible to obesity and type 2 diabetes, which suggests that the underlying genes were present in our common ancestor over 70 million years ago. Another criticism is that we do not know about everybody, everywhere, at every time in the past, and that is also entirely true. Fortunately, we don't need to know everything about everybody at every time in the past. What we need to know are what were the conditions in Africa, particularly 100,000 years ago, just before behaviorally modern humans began to emigrate and people the whole world, but the same conditions existed for almost 1 million years prior to that, giving them plenty of time to shape genetic selection or to refine genetic selection. Another argument that we hear is you really can't know what people were eating in the past. Well, actually, we have excellent information now coming from human skeletal remains, from archaeological finds, from increasingly sophisticated studies of hunter-gatherers, and from nutrient analyses of the wild foods and fish and game that are wild plant foods and fish and game that our ancestors had accessible to consume. That gives us this argument that we believe now is what, on the whole, our ancestors were consuming about 30% of their calories in the form of protein, about 35% as carbohydrate, and about 35% as fat. I'm not going to, this would be what the dietary recommendations that we would make for that. Now, some of these, I think we're all going to concur with. Nobody's going to argue about any of these suggestions, I think. These are the ones that are going to cause concern or disagreement amongst us. But let's see if that really be true. I'm not sure how disagreement we're really going to end up with here. I think there is a paleo diet that could be a vegan or close to vegan. I'm not going to say much about fat because there's so many people here who know so much more about fat than I do. But I would like to point out that our ancestors were getting about 10 times as much long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids as we are. There's only one kind of people now on Earth that do get the same amount of long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids that our ancestors did, and those are the Inuit, the Eskimos. It's interesting that they and Cro-Magnons have cranial capacity, that's brain size, about 200 cc's greater than that for the rest of us. It's true that correlation and causation are not necessarily the same, but I'm just saying it's sort of an interesting observation about the possible benefits of long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids. We're consuming more total carbohydrate than our ancestors did. However, the majority of what we are consuming now comes from refined grains and sugar, substances that weren't available to ancestral humans when our genes were being selected. These are new, alien to our biology. On the other hand, our ancestors consumed far more fruits and vegetables than we do now. Probably they were getting 3 times, or more than 3 times, the amount of fruits and vegetables that we consume at present. Our ancestors did love honey. We think that on average, maybe 2 to 3% of their calories came from honey, but it came in the form of wild honey as honeycomb. Sugar really is empty calories. Honeycomb has some protein and some minerals, so it has some nutritional benefit over and above the sugar that you might get from a sack in the grocery store. Our ancestors knew that cereal grains were edible and as a possible source of energy, but they were consumed only in times of shortage, and that is because processing so that they could be digested from the available technology was just too labor intensive for routine use. The stones down there are an ancestral mortar and pestle, if you will. Despite the fact that they did not have grains, they still had far more fiber intake than we do now. And the reason for that is very simple. The fiber in wild fruits and vegetables, the fiber content of wild fruits and vegetables is much greater than the content of fiber in cultivars. They have been modified over millennia to have less fiber, and that's where our ancestors were primarily getting their fiber. If you look at minerals, in nearly all cases, our ancestors are getting a greater mineral intake than we are. There is obviously one glaring exception, and that is that we have far more sodium in our diet than they did. Our ancestors were getting many times more potassium than sodium in their diet. We estimate that their sodium intake was roughly a gram. The Yanomamo have 750 milligrams as their daily sodium intake. We get more sodium, than potassium in our diet. And I think you could argue that we are the only vertebrates, free-living vertebrates, for whom that's the case. Vitamins are very much like minerals in the sense that our ancestors seem to be getting substantially more than we're getting now. Sometime later, ask me about vitamin D. Now here's where we're going to have a little problem, I think, because our ancestors, as best we can figure, were getting twice the protein that we are now. The protein they were consuming, we calculate that they were consuming, falls within the guidelines established by the Institute of Medicine. Here's the same Time magazine cover. The article says that red meat is probably carcinogenic, increases the lifetime risk of colorectal cancer from 5% to 6%. Now that statistic in and of itself is not going to deter dedicated meat eaters, I assure you, but it is an interesting and necessarily important figure to consider. Another problem is that here's a comment from that very article, a quote from the Time magazine article. People trying to eat right are buffeted by health recommendations that seem prone to being overturned years later. The article on colorectal cancer and meat intake appeared in Lancet Oncology, and it was based on a meta-analysis of 800 studies. There was a prior study that meta-analyzed 3,500 studies. It said fruits, vegetables, and cancer. It said that fruits and vegetables probably, that's the same word that they used in the Lancet Oncology article, probably protect against several types of cancer. And for a couple of years after that, I made a big point of this when I made presentations, hither and yon, only to find that several studies thereafter said, well, no, maybe there's no particular fruit and anti-cancer effect of fruits and vegetables. My point here is I don't know whether there is a protective effect or not, but I do know that what appear to be very substantial studies can be overturned later on. So now here we're coming to the crux of this whole meeting as I see it. We have to make our nutritional advice, or it makes sense to make our nutritional advice consistent with sustainability. We are going to need 70% more food to feed people by 2050 because no matter what we do, our population is going to go up to that point. My argument would be that nutrition science should devise a program that offers sustainability and provides nutritional content comparable to what our ancestors have been consuming for the Paleo Fad has gone on for over 1 million years, so it's a very long-term fad. We do, however, have to consider land use, energy use, water use, CO2 emissions, and the reds are from the ruminant meat-producing animals, and you see that all of those are, the worst of all these are from just those animals, the ruminants, beef and sheep particularly. The best come from plants and from dairy products. And we have to make our nutritional recommendations in accord with these realities. And everyone has spoken about this. It's no question that beef is a real problem as far as food is concerned. The meat lover, like myself, has twice the carbon footprint of the vegetarian and even more than the vegan. So we have a conflict. Red meat is incompatible with environmental health in the contemporary world. However, humans have an innate desire for meat. The war on delicious, the lower right-hand corner of the Time magazine cover, why would we think meat is delicious? Well, the answer is it is literally in our genes. Not only Robert Foley, but nearly all paleoanthropologists think that when we became hunters and fishers and gathered more, included more red meat or animal food products in our diets, that was not, perhaps not what started us, but that was certainly accelerated our environmental progress to the point we have become, where we became behaviorally modern. Hunters and gatherers all around the world prefer meat to any other food. I think in the Time magazine article, David made a comment basically to that point. We're about to have a series on the Mediterranean diet called the gold standard. I would say the paleo diet there is the old standard then. The Mediterranean diet was partly derived from Crete, where there had been a prior study before the 7-country study organized by the Rockefeller Foundation. And what they found was that a majority of the people they surveyed at that time thought that meat was their favorite food. And lastly, all across the world, as income goes up, meat consumption goes up, which would suggest that people are naturally hungry for meat. There you see a graph that shows the same thing. So if we're going to say that we're going to have a sustainable diet, but it should nevertheless deliver Paleolithic level nutrients, why is that? Here's what I would sort of recommend as a paleo vegan diet, perhaps, or restricted paleo diet that will incorporate some fat-free dairy. Our ancestors, of course, had no dairy foods whatsoever after being weaned because they had no domesticated animals. But we can put some in because it's good and it's what's available to us. We can go from modest whole grain intake to moderate whole grain intake to a fair amount. And I still think we should have 30% protein, but I suggest that it come chiefly from plant sources. The fantastic dinner we had last night had plenty of protein, tasted great, but it was from plant sources. Now, we could or could not include poultry and seafood, but that's a matter for discussion. Why also should we consider, or why do we want to have a Paleolithic cachet to what we're going to recommend? Well, that's because advice based solely on epidemiological statistics, and almost everything we've talked about here has been epidemiological to some extent. It has a limited effect on public behavior. What we need to complement statistical insights is to maximize their impact with a theory of disease, and paleo could be that theory. Here are a whole slew of magazine articles that have appeared over the past few years just in the United States alone. The paleo concept resonates with the public. It's a crowd pleaser. It has sex appeal, if you will. It's not just in the United States. Here are books from all over the world also focusing on the paleo diet. It's popular. It somehow is gut resonant. So here is where we stand now. We have statistics-based recommendations. They're very scientific, but they seem to have confused the public. They have strong research, but they don't have, in my opinion, there is no paradigm. Here's where the paleo community is. We have, if you'll pardon me, investigatively challenged recommendations, but they are attractive to the public. We have limited research, but it's a plausible paradigm, a very plausible paradigm. So please, can we perhaps meld Paleolithic ideas with strong epidemiological technique and come to an attractive theory that is defended with investigative rigor, that would be evidence-based and gut resonant, if you'll pardon me. And finally, we have to modify what that would be on its own because of our concerns about sustainability. We will modify to adapt what we recommend. It's adaptive, but I want to point out for sure, this is adaptive, not mitigative, and hence it's temporary. Here's what I mean. Adaptation, addresses symptoms. I say that if we come to fully adapt in all respects, not just for nutrition, but in many other aspects of life today, we'll come to have 10 or 11 billion humans in the year 2100. They'll be existing. Earth's other life forms will be going down the drain. However, if we simultaneously take measures to mitigate our situation, to address the causes, we could decrease our population, and it is entirely possible that by 2200, which is a long time away, but it's not bad to think long term, we could have 100 million humans flourishing, not just existing, but flourishing, and Earth, other life forms be on the way back. We have now a non-sustainable situation. I recommend that we adapt in the near future as a partway measure, and that we mitigate in hopes that the far future will be optimal. Currently, we are eating unsustainable, unhealthful diets. In the near future, we ought to fight for sustainable, may I say, pseudo-Paleolithic diets. And in the far future, when we've got the other big problems down to where we would like them to be, then we can go back to the true paleo diet that incorporates meat for those who want it. I think, important as nutrition is, that overpopulation, climate change, and socioeconomic inequality are the mega problems. And when we address those, when we have addressed those, then we can go back to advocating what is the diet our ancestors consumed for 1 million years. Thanks.
Boyd, thank you so much. You bring a really unique perspective here, and one that I think has to be part of this conversation for it to do the intended job. You can't find common ground if you only invite to your party people who are all standing on the same patch in the first place. So I think that's really important. I'll also note, as someone who's reflected on this, I agree with you about the issue of a fundamental paradigm and underlying theory. I've commented for years that, to the best of my knowledge, and I have some friends and colleagues who work in this space, that randomized clinical trials are not conducted when they put sea lions and actual lions in a zoological park. You know, they don't try to figure out whether or not the sea lions ought to be eating fish or maybe bamboo. They eat fish because they were eating fish when they found them, and the lions get meat and the pandas get bamboo. And there really is this fundamental divide where we think of all of nature that way, that there's some link between creatures and their native lifestyle, their native habitat. And then there's us, where we can't seem to answer any question without a randomized clinical trial. We kind of ignore the work that you've done and others have done over the years. I think that's fundamentally important, and an interesting notion that that kind of cornerstone may be critical to structures that actually can change prevailing behavior. People say, yeah, it's not just the latest study. There's bedrock underneath that. A really interesting notion. Mary, if you're okay with this, I want to actually, now I've just finished telling Boyd I love him, and I'm glad he's here, and now I want to attack him. Yeah. And then I have a question really for the two of you to wrestle with together, if that's okay, and then,
Sure.
Then we can go as the Spirit moves you. So I'm going to ask you the question, Boyd, that always comes up whenever I'm talking about different diets and thinking about paleo, and you deftly sidestep this. And I was waiting to see whether or not you were going to boldly go into this space or not, and that's the issue of lifespan. So, you know, adaptation can only work with the resources available to it. If our genetic adaptation was shaped for a, you know, life expectancy that was often 20, 30 or something like that, and a lifespan that was 4 decades, then the extrapolation of that dietary pattern, human health effects, to a lifespan twice as long is fraught with peril. What do we know about Stone Age lifespan? What do we know about, essentially the duration of our adaptations?
I'm so pleased that you modified that question. I cannot tell you how many times I have been asked, why would people eat like this when they only lived, you know, when they only lived 30 years? They all died at age 30. And of course, our ancestors did have an average life expectancy of in the late 30s, as did all humanity until just after the Industrial Revolution. There are good statistics from Sweden in the 1700s where their life expectancy was 35 or something like that, and there is I'm sure the method would be criticized by today's epidemiologists, but the earliest examination of life expectancy was in London, and it was 19 years. It was a pretty sickly place to live. Well, the answer that you wanted was that once the big reason that hunter-gatherers had a short life expectancy was because of infant mortality. They lost many of their young people before age 5 and before age 10. But once you reached age 15 or 20, they have a life expectancy that was frequently to 60 or 70. Now, I doubt that any of them made 80 or 90 as people are in the world today, but they did, a great number of them reached in their 60s and 70s. There's a theory called the grandmother theory, that by the time we got to the point where women were living beyond their reproductive period, they made an immense contribution to the welfare of their group, and in a way contributed to the ongoing trajectory of human evolution. And they wouldn't have been grandmothers unless they were able to live longer than just 30 or 40 years.
I think in our conversation about writers on evolutionary biology, you mentioned E.O. Wilson, and The Social Conquest of Earth is one of Wilson's books. And there, that notion that there's competition at the level of genes, but also social groups. And so there actually could be a survival advantage for an entire group. Ah. You know, I guess the grandmother effect would figure in there, essentially.
Oh, great. There are two theories. One is that evolution works for the individual. Selection works on the individual. And there's also group selection. And for a long time, the two advocates of these two evolutionary theories, box it out with each other. But now it seems like you might imagine that both are important, the individual selective forces and group selective forces. And the grandmothers would be one of the factors involved groups.
Right.
Cooperation might not be ideal for the individual, perhaps. You'd like to have everything for yourself and nothing for anyone else. But clearly, cooperation has evolved amongst us more so than any other mammalian species. Presumably, that is a group selection business.
Yeah, fascinating book, by the way, Social Conquest of Earth. All right, so you did a nice job with that. So Mary, you may have a question. I've got a question for the two of you. All right, your question first. Go ahead. Then I'm going to assault both of you.
Okay, is this on? Yeah. Okay. We've been, so far anyway, it seems eating more fruits and vegetables is going to be at the top of this common ground list, whatever we come up with. But it strikes me that as wonderful as that is, it really doesn't connect to the reason that we're here, which is that people are not doing the things that they might do. If you go to the supermarket and follow people around, they aren't spending a great deal of time in the produce section. It's the frozen foods and all the newfangled things that you may all know about Beyond Meat and other people like them who are trying to scientifically take what meat is and make it from plants. And people see that as this wondrous new forward-thinking thing rather than buying fennel and sweet potatoes. So that's sort of sets up my question of what we're doing versus what most people are doing. And then yesterday I heard this guy on TV talking about marketing. He works for Frito-Lay. And his first rule is to inspire people with things like dang seriously cheesy and the new age of snacking. And that's the competition as much as any difference between, paleo or vegan or any of the other things. And so I just wanted, maybe both of you would talk about how you think what we do here today and tomorrow will lead to somehow crossing that divide.
You want to answer first?
After you.
Okay. I don't need it.
Yes, so Mary, you
well, that's one reason that I promote the paleo idea, because I think it has crowd appeal. I think it appeals in a way that epidemiological statistics do not. The p-value of a study, people say that, it just has no impact on people. The paleo concept, in the book that I showed there, the cover, The Gifts of Athena, the author makes a comparison with, the point about the germ theory in the 19th century. This was a theory that could be quickly grasped by the population, and they could do something about it. And as a result, hygiene, particularly in the Western countries, improved, and infectious disease rates began going down substantially before the best of the public health procedures, and far, far before antibiotic drugs were introduced and so forth. I think that the paleo concept could be something like the germ theory, that it would resonate with the public and would perhaps affect or inform the behavior of somebody in the grocery store, especially if you can find nutritional foods that are easy to prepare. I think women, and to some extent men, who are cooking it, preparing meals, are so stressed out and so busy today that they need something that's easy and quick to work with, rather than something that's better nutritionally and harder to work with. I'm sorry, I've talked too long.
No, not at all. I would only say, though, that the popularity of paleo, if you look in the, maybe in the popular press, is like, yeah, I can eat a cheeseburger. Right. And your new list, even with some animal foods, has, not so many cheeseburgers and a little bit more fish, and down at the bottom, and still more protein sources from plant foods. Do you think the popularity will maintain even with that adaptation?
I hope so. I think it is partly people who are inherently, genetically want it. We all want, even those of us who have conditioned themselves away from it, deep down inside, you love to have a steak, I know. But, that is probably explains part of the popularity for the paleo concept. But it also, when I've spoken to groups who've not heard anything about this, they come up and say, that is so reasonable, so easy to understand, to appreciate why things are the way they are. How come nobody's ever thought about this before? And people have. Back to Rousseau, who wrote that most of our diseases are the result of human civilization and so forth. So it's not a new thing, but it has an attractive quality that needs to be, at least could be tried.
So I can address your question as well, Mary, and then again I have a provocation really for the two of you. So, you know, this issue is going to recur, and what about the cost of healthy food and all of that? And I think one of the things we have to recognize is that we're trying to reverse engineer a pathological sequence, right? I mean, there was perhaps misinformation, there was perhaps distortions of preference, there were changes in the environment, and then we've built upon some of our transgressions and propagated them, and now there's profit that derives from those transgressions. Just read Michael Moss, right? Willful manipulation of the food supply to maximize the eating people do of all the foods they shouldn't be eating. And it's not as if an agreement about what healthy eating is reverses all of that. But on the other hand, we're never going to reverse all of that if the public doesn't think we know what healthy eating is in the first place, right? So I think we can acknowledge that even if we only take that first step here or contribute mightily to that first step, it begins something important, right? You cannot get there from here if you can't agree where there is. Now, agreeing where there is doesn't necessarily get you there. Then you first have to start the hard job of the journey, right? But the journey could begin there. And then the other thing I would note, and I think Dean mentioned this beautifully as he always does, that the proposition of longevity and vitality may in fact be a very enticing proposition. We're not just talking about what you can't eat, but the life that you can have, more years in life, more life in years. And Dan Buettner's getting lots of traction by showing people, look at these folks. They live to be 100, they don't get chronic disease. Anyway, if I may, a provocation for the two of you.
Let me just add one point to what you just made. And that is, I have tried hard to get people to look for being healthier and living longer. What we want to promote is that if you eat in this way and exercise the way I think we mostly all agree on, you'll be sexier. You'll look more attractive to the opposite sex. And that may sound cynical and silly, but think about it.
Well, now we need your wife's take on this. We can't just take your word for that. So here's the provocation.
It depends on what you're working with to begin with.
Well, that's true. We all have to deal with that challenge. So I've been inclined to note that the average person carrying a flag in the Paleo parade will procrastinate for pastrami, right? As you said, cheeseburgers, right? There was no Paleolithic cheese, there was no Paleolithic pastrami. So to the two of you, you representing the scientific voice, Boyd, Mary, you the media, what do we need to do to both preserve the value of this, this sort of paradigm-based approach to diet, and yet get people to be realistic about it, because it's been horribly perverted, hasn't it? I think the average person who cheers for paleo, is eating highly processed meats, and that it's bacon and salami and sausage, and there was none of that in the Paleolithic era.
Absolutely.
Right? So what's the dance between the two of you, the science and the media side, to help us convey the message that's valuable, but discard the bathwater?
I think the science voice is so much quieter than the industry voice that the challenge is enormous, and that is the challenge. Those dang cheesy Cheetos or whatever are 100 times the volume that any consensus that you all might come to here. It's what you mentioned in the Michael Moss book, the idea of natural foods that are anything but just go into any supermarket and look at what's there, even supermarkets that claim to be more healthful than your average ordinary supermarket. And I just think that the real key is to finding some way to compete with that voice, because already, a couple of speakers into this, you've already seems to me quite clearly come to the consensus that more fruits and vegetables are a crucial point, right? No matter, I mean, maybe somebody's going to say something to disagree with that, but I can't imagine it. You still are, you know, this tiny, quiet produce voice versus this huge, loud, screaming industry voice.
But Boyd is not providing cover for the, I don't need to worry about fruits and vegetables, I just need to eat more pastrami. But you know, can't we use those experts? I mean, if there are articles from experts on the paleo diet to help convey, they're the ones also saying eat more fruits and vegetables. I mean, that's sort of a surprise message from that quarter, isn't it? Isn't that, that's a new twist. Look who's telling you to eat more fruits and vegetables now, right? Isn't that different?
I think the paleo, everything I've ever read, correct me if I'm wrong, all the paleo prescriptions allow you to have meat, but they include loads and loads and loads of produce.
I think that we can incorporate the two concepts in a unified message. And I think that if we get that out, it will resonate with the paleo community. I think that the people that I really have no entrepreneurial interest in the paleo diet. I've really done nothing with it as far as that's concerned. But I do have a number of friends who, or acquaintances who work in that capacity, and every one of them seems to be, they're all interested in making money, I guess, but every one of them seems to be a fairly sincere, dedicated person, fairly knowledgeable, and I think that every one of them would be interested in the concept of sustainability and how to promote a paleo diet that would be in accord with sustainability.
Well, it seems like there's an opportunity. I know we have a room full of journalists, so the idea that there might be, you know, some dedicated coverage to the world's paleo experts talking about sustainability in that interface. Dean, did you have a question? And then we're in the red zone here, so Cynthia's going to throw me off the stage.
So I know we're short of time, so I'll be brief. But you've talked about sustainability. You talked about kind of this progression of, you know, ultimately we'll get to the most sustainable diet and a big slab of red meat. And yet I had a hard time reconciling that with the fact that more global warming is caused by livestock consumption than all forms of transportation combined, that it takes 10 times more energy to eat higher on the food chain. It's the major cause of deforestation. How is that sustainable? Why would eating red meat be a good thing for sustainability?
I must have been unclear. We need to address all sorts of problems that we have in the world today. And to my mind, one of the greatest of them is the number of people we have. If we were to drastically reduce the number of people and the
we can do that if they follow a paleo diet.
Falling all over the earth. It just all we need to do is continue that, to advance that, and we'll get to the point where you could have enough cows to feed everybody as much meat as they want, and it wouldn't harm the world.
Well, how can you say that if we know that that meat is what causes global warming, is the major cause of global warming?
You're talking about a population of 100 million, right?
That's right.
Now, I shudder to think what would need to happen between now and a population of 100 million.
Well, all that needs to happen. Are you familiar with the way the average fertility rate is going in the world? Well, and this is not just in Western nations like Italy with 1.3 or Japan with 1.3 or something like that. Even in sub-Saharan Africa and in Muslim countries, the average number of children born to a woman is falling down very rapidly.
So
all we need to do is to continue that trend.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying. You're saying that eating meat is sustainable if we reduce the world's population by orders of magnitude? That's hardly a compelling argument for the benefits of eating meat.
Maybe not to you.
No, not to me at all.
Cynthia, can we take one more question?
I think we really have to wrap it up.
Wrap it up.
Awfully quickly.
You'll find Dr. Eaton out in the hall, all right?
Great.
All right, we'll exit the stage. Boyd, thank you so much. Mary, thank you.
Thank you.